It's July 17th here in Seoul, and I'm Kim Dami. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour, starting with the flooded roadway underpass in South Korea's Osong. 3 more bodies have been recovered from the accident overnight, raising the death toll to 13 now. At least 39 lives have been lost due to torrential downpours during this year's monsoon. President Yoon Suk Yeol returned home this morning from a week-long trip to Europe, including participation in the NATO Summit in Lithuania and a surprise visit to Ukraine. We take a look back on his diplomacy in Europe. Russian leader Vladimir Putin says that his country has sufficient cluster munitions and threatened to use them against Ukraine if Ukraine uses them. In the meantime, according to reports from Ukraine and Poland, the Wagner Group has arrived in Belarus from Russia. The torrential downpours that have pounded South Korea have led to at least 39 deaths so far. Authorities are still looking for 9 missing people. Our Kim Jong-sil starts us off.
The heavy downpours in central regions that began last week here in South Korea have killed dozens of people. 13 of those deaths came from flooding in an underground tunnel in Osong, Chungcheongbuk-do province. The South Korean Fire Department said around 15 vehicles, including a bus, were trapped inside the tunnel as the river rapidly overflowed, causing 60,000 tons of water to fill the tunnel in minutes. 13 bodies were found as of Monday morning, although only 12 were originally reported missing. Authorities say since water in the tunnel is still neck-high, more bodies could be found. South Korea's Land Minister Won Il-yong visited the site early on Monday morning and said a thorough investigation will be conducted regarding the disaster, as some have raised voices saying there should have been traffic control. And at least 19 people have lost their lives in eastern Gyeongsangbuk-do province. The torrential rain has caused landslides and flooding in Yecheon-gun County, killing at least 9. 8 are still missing in Yecheon, with more than 2,900 firemen and military personnel looking for them. But the rescue operation is hard due to damp, muddy ground. Tens of thousands of homes across the country have also been evacuated as residents flee the rain. More than 10,000 residents in 14 cities and provinces, mainly South Korea's southeastern Gyeongsangbuk-do province, as well as central regions, have fled their homes and are taking shelter. The authorities have said at least 139 houses have been flooded and hundreds of public facilities, including roads, have been damaged. The Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasures Headquarters is sending a special support team to the affected regions to help repair some of the damage. Kim Jong-sil, Arirang News.
The deadly torrential rain here also brought the focus of the world's media to South Korea, with reports saying the rain is a result of the climate crisis that is now gripping East Asia. Lee Seung-ja has more.
Despite preparations made and warnings given ahead of the monsoon rains that have slammed parts of South Korea, this year's rainy season has been one of the deadliest in recent years, claiming dozens of lives and leaving many missing. And a number of foreign media outlets have covered the deadly torrential rain, as well as the devastating damage, including the New York Times, which reported on the flooding of a 685-meter-long underpass in Osong, Chungcheongbuk-do province, where over a dozen people were trapped by flash flooding. Bloomberg News said that South Korea suffers from storms and heavy rain every summer, with casualties and property damage reported due to natural disasters every year. Reuters also reported on the tragedy in Osong and said the disaster occurred despite a government pledge to strengthen preparations for heavy rains after Seoul was severely damaged by the heaviest rain in 115 years last year. It also cited a local who frequently uses the route, who said that the government should have blocked access to the underpass as the flooding was expected. However, according to Al Jazeera, South Korea is regularly hit by flooding during the summer monsoon period, but it's typically well prepared and the death toll is usually relatively low. Nevertheless, the foreign media outlets also cited a number of climate experts who say extreme rain in South Korea in recent years is a result of climate change. This includes a CNN broadcast, which said that scientists have warned that heavy rain damage is increasing throughout East Asia as the possibility of extreme weather changes increases due to the climate crisis. The world continues to keep a close eye on the situation in South Korea, as it could easily be a similar situation in other parts of the world, with volatile and extreme weather patterns being reported globally. 이승재, Arirang News.
Washington says it remains concerned about Pyongyang's additional ICBM launches and the prospect of another nuclear test. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, speaking to CBS Face the Nation on Sunday, said, while there is no indication yet, it would not be a surprise if the North conducts another ICBM test. Sullivan added that Washington has been concerned for some time that the North would conduct what would be its 7th nuclear test. He said that the U.S. will continue to closely coordinate with South Korea and other allies on the matter. Now, the comments come after the regime launched its Hwasong-18 solid-fuel ICBM last week under the guidance of the leader Kim Jong-un. President Yoon Suk Yeol has returned home from his trip to Europe, which included a surprise visit to Ukraine. There, he pledged more non-lethal military supplies. Our top office correspondent Oh Soo-young reports.
South Korea has promised more non-lethal military supplies to Ukraine and over $200 million in humanitarian aid and loans to rebuild the war-torn country. Veering off his official trip to Poland, President Yoon Suk Yeol made a sudden state visit to Ukraine, traveling a total of 27 hours through road and rail, becoming the first South Korean leader to visit a nation at war.
우크라이나의 연대와 희망의 메시지를 전하기 위해 여기에 왔습니다. 저는 저와 우리 국민은 우크라이나가 자유를 되찾을 때까지 국권을 회복할 때까지 여러분들과 함께 할 것입니다.
Following his talks with Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky, Yoon declared a new aid package for Ukraine, dubbed the Ukraine Peace and Solidarity Initiative, comprising nearly 9 agreements on expanding Seoul's military, humanitarian and reconstruction assistance. According to Principal Deputy National Security Advisor Kim Tae-ho, Yoon first declared support for Zelensky's 10-point peace formula and efforts to hold a peace conference. While Seoul did not announce any lethal weapon support, it pledged to expand supplies of critical equipment for Ukrainian forces and support the recovery and counseling for children traumatized and violated by the ongoing war.
Specifically, we can happily conclude that an agreement on the transfer of specialized vehicles and technical equipment, including for demining, is already being implemented. This helps us preserve human lives. Thank you, Mr. President, for new initiatives on financial, technical and humanitarian aid to Ukraine.
In terms of humanitarian aid, Seoul plans to increase its annual contribution this year by 30% on year to $150 million. Yoon also noted that around $100 million has been allocated for long-term low-interest loans in a bilateral MOU on funding Ukraine's various reconstruction projects. Yoon and Zelensky further agreed to cooperate on nurturing Ukraine's future generation, supporting online and offline education by providing laptops and rebuilding facilities, as well as creating a scholarship for Ukrainian students in South Korea. Prior to the summit, Yoon visited Bucha, a city whose people suffered brutal war crimes and massacre by Russian forces. He also toured Irpin, where fierce fighting led to nearly 70% of the city being destroyed. Amid concerns that Korea's broadening support for Kyiv may raise eyebrows in Moscow, Seoul says it will continue to pursue stable relations with Russia. Still, Yoon made it clear that Koreans stand in solidarity for the freedom, peace and recovery of Ukraine.
Drawing parallels with South Korea's own rise from the ashes of war through the socio-economic miracle on the Han River, Yoon said he is confident that Ukraine is on the same trajectory of post-war recovery in the miracle on the Dnipro River. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News, Warsaw.
Now, President Yoon's visit to Kyiv symbolizes more than just providing support and cooperation for the war-torn nation. It's also expected to result in strengthened security ties with the U.S. and Japan. Our foreign affairs correspondent Bae Eun-ji explains.
While pledging to expand support, President Yoon highlighted the importance of freedom and peace in Ukraine in a show of solidarity.
대한민국은 우크라이나의 자유와 평화, 번영을 가꾸는 동반자가 될 것이며 나아가 우크라이나와 함께 세계의 자유, 평화, 번영에 함께 기여하는 믿음직한 파트너가 될 것입니다. 그 희망찬 미래를 향해 저와 젤렌스키 대통령은 더욱 긴밀히 소통하고 협력해 나아갈 것입니다.
Pundits say Yoon's visit could be part of South Korea's efforts to strengthen security cooperation with the U.S. and Japan, as all three leaders have now visited Ukraine. In February, U.S. President Joe Biden made a surprise visit to Kyiv and promised to provide $500 million in additional military aid. Then in March, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida also visited Ukraine and vowed to supply $30 million worth of non-lethal equipment. As South Korea works to strengthen partnerships with the U.S. and Japan, President Yoon's visit to Ukraine is expected to have brought the countries closer together ahead of their trilateral summit scheduled for next month in Washington. In fact, after wrapping up President Yoon's trip to the war-torn nation, the country's Deputy National Security Advisor, Kim Tae-hyo, said this came as South Korea works to expand cooperation with other countries.
Above all, President Yoon's visit took place as the Yoon administration's value diplomacy and responsible diplomacy have expanded beyond Asia, as the country works to closely cooperate with Europe and other parts of the world.
He added the issues on Ukraine could be discussed at summits, but by actually being on site, it was easier to tell what kind of cooperation was truly needed. He also explained that President Yoon's visit came at Zelensky's invitation, and that Yoon made the final decision after careful considerations over security and safety. Seoul's presidential office reportedly said it understood the invitation as part of Ukraine's expectations for South Korea, in terms of its role in the ongoing war, which is the most urgent issue within the international community. 배은지, Arirang News.
The past week was an eventful one in terms of diplomacy for President Yoon Suk Yeol, making his second trip to a NATO summit and wrapping up the trip with a surprise visit to Ukraine. We take a look back on the trip with Professor An Jung-sang this morning. Good morning.
Morning.
President Yoon visited Ukraine, where he promised a package of security, humanitarian, and reconstruction in the aid for the country. Now, what's your take on his surprise visit there and the Yoon-Zelensky summit?
Well, I have two comments on President Yoon's visit to the Ukraine. First, if we look at a big picture, it was not a surprise visit at all, interestingly. And I mean that you have to look at it from the trilateral alliance perspectives. U.S. President Joe Biden visited Ukraine last February, and the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida visited Ukraine last March, and then President Yoon visited last week, right? As you recall, all three visits were surprise visits, right? And also, as a matter of fact, three leaders are set for a coming summit next month in Washington, D.C. So I think that from that perspective, I think it's kind of, in a way, it's kind of prearranged, from the beginning. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the underlying point of a three-relay visit to the Ukraine is, I think, is designed to send a clear message of a stronger trilateral alliance to the Russia and China and North Korea. And from this economic perspectives, it might provide the South Korean an opportunity to more actively participate in a post-war reconstruction project in Ukraine.
Sure. So Yoon visiting Ukraine, it was just a matter of time, what you're saying is.
Well, I think this is more important is what happened in Ukraine is more like when it was arranged, everything. So I think basically from that perspective, possibly it's prearranged everything, but they put it as a confidential information because it's very sensitive data.
Right. And it was President Yoon's second NATO summit in what was a packed schedule, from attending the summit to sitting down with leaders from around 10 countries for bilateral talks. Now, how do you evaluate Yoon's NATO trip this year?
Well, as a matter of fact, actually, it was not an independent visit to the NATO one, So President Yoon was invited as one of the participants of the Indo-Pacific partners, global partners, including Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, right? And given the fact that South Korea is not intending to join the NATO, which is not legally possible at this moment, I think that it's important to use that NATO summit as a convenient venue for bilateral summit, just like what happened with other NATO leaders. In that respect, I think that President Yoon did his best on the job.
Sure. So on top of the NATO summit, visiting Ukraine, not too surprising according to you, but there was also a visit to Poland, right? How significant was that trip?
Actually, I guess many people have asked, ask the question, why is he visiting Poland, right? But now we know the answer why he visited this. It's quite its neighboring country. Actually, I had an interview like last week about this same issue and there's the same question, why he's visiting Poland.
Right.
And now we know.
Right.
At the time, we didn't know it was like he's visiting to Ukraine, but we know that as a fact, he will plan to visit Ukraine. So, other than that, Poland is a regional distribution hub for the Central Eastern Europe, and it has been a great business partner for South Korean companies for a long time. So, given that Poland is one of the neighboring countries to the Ukraine, both countries, both Korea and Poland, can work together in a various post-war reconstruction project in the future. I think that's kind of a significance on his visiting to Poland at this time.
Sure, it was all planned out overall. Now we're looking at the bigger picture, right?
Possibly, right.
Right. And on the sidelines of the NATO summit, we have to talk about the Yoon Kishida sit down. Now, there, Yoon asked Kishida if Korean experts could get involved in the whole Fukushima wastewater discharge process. And Kishida said he'll do anything to secure the health of the Korean and the Japanese people. Professor Ahn, what's your view of their talks this time in Vilnius?
It's a very interesting question because I've been checking data and information both Korean side and the Japanese side. And I found those discrepancies, the differences on the press release between South Korean Presidential Office and Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs regarding on the July bilateral summit between the Japan and Korea. And the President Yoon provide kind of a precondition, prerequest, depends on how we put it. Well, namely, first was the monitoring data sharing on a real-time basis. And second is the Korean expert participation in the monitoring process. And third, immediate suspension of discharge for any excess density of radioactive materials. Interestingly, if you look it up at Japanese government website, they didn't make any statement on his second condition about Korean expert participation, and even the Korean government press release didn't really saying he sending message, but Prime Minister Kishida did not make any comment or respond anything. So I guess there was no meeting of mind on the Korean expert participation on the process. That's a really big concern. Also, the problem about Fukushima water, the discharge issue is that there are possible things happen in the future about Japanese, Fukushima fishery product re-import into the Korean in the future. That's the really concerning things that both countries really carefully approach it, what happened in the future.
Sure. Professor An Jun-sung, thank you so much for joining us this morning. You have a good day.
Thank you.
Imagine facing an urgent situation in a foreign country and you have difficulties communicating effectively due to an inability to speak the language. Well, here in Korea, that's not so much of a problem. Our Choi Soo-hyung reports.
No more need to hesitate when you are in an emergency situation in South Korea. The Korean National Police Agency started its 112 emergency call interpretation service on July 3rd. The service aims at assisting any foreign visitors or residents who lack the ability to speak Korean with their emergency calls to 112. Currently, the service is provided by 4 interpreters, 2 each for English and Chinese.
喂，你好，这里是112报警中心中文翻译服务。
Rather than using other interpretation services, people call 112 when they are in urgent and desperate situations. We feel a great sense of fulfillment that we are able to assist by translating during this time.
In April of last year, there was feedback that foreign visitors and immigrants to Korea missed out on immediately reporting a crime committed against them during the crucial golden time 1 hour after the incident due to the language barrier. After more than a year of preparation, the service has been launched to address this issue, coinciding with the rapid growth of foreign tourists following the downgrading of the COVID-19 pandemic to an endemic.
Two French women, they got lost their way down from the top of Samak Mountain, which is located in Chuncheon. So we try to communicate every 30 minutes to 40 minutes because we wanted to make sure if they're safe in there and if they have any changes of their location. So finally we rescue them.
The previous method, which involved recording foreigners' reports, outsourcing the translation to private institutions, and then relaying the information to the police station, resulted in an average response time of over 6 minutes. However, since the simultaneous interpretation is in a three-way system involving the reporting individual, police officers, and the interpreter, the average response time has been reduced to 2 minutes and 21 seconds. Foreigners also have high expectations of receiving significant assistance in the case of emergencies.
In my case, I have been living in Korea for 13 years, so I can speak Korean to some extent. However, in urgent situations, it would be reassuring to have a service someday that I can immediately use in my native language.
Police officers urge foreign visitors to Korea to just call 112 if they become victims of crime.
The police agency is planning to increase the number of supported languages as the demand for interpretation services continues to grow. Choi Hyung, Arirang News.
Good morning, I'm Matthew Ashley, and we now turn over to stories from around the world. We begin with Russian President Vladimir Putin threatening to use cluster bombs in Ukraine. Speaking on Sunday, he said that the country has a sufficient stockpile of the munitions and that they would be used if cluster munitions are deployed against Russian forces in Ukraine. The comment comes after Ukraine said on Thursday that it had received cluster bombs from the United States. The US says the cluster bombs are meant to address Ukraine's shortage of shells as it continues its counter-offensive. Cluster bombs release large numbers of explosive bomblets designed to kill personnel and destroy vehicles over a wide area. But the weapon's use is controversial, as it can indiscriminately affect civilians, and some bomblets can explode years later, similar to landmines. The use or stockpile of the weapon is banned in over 100 countries. Meanwhile, Ukraine and Poland reported over the weekend that fighters from the mercenary Wagner group have arrived in Belarus from Russia. Now, singer, actor and fashion icon Jane Birkin has died at the age of 76. Local reports say she was found dead in her home in Paris on Sunday local time. Born in Britain, Birkin found fame in France in the 60s and permanently moved there in 1970. She was best known for the iconic 1969 soundtrack Je t'aime moi non plus, which she recorded with French singer-songwriter Serge Gainsbourg. But because of the song's overtly sexual lyrics, it was banned on radio in several countries, even drawing criticism from the Vatican. Birkin also gained notoriety for appearing naked on screen in the 1966 film Blow Up. Also a fashion icon, she's known to have inspired the Hermes Birkin handbag. Now moving on to sports news, Spain's Carlos Alcaraz has won his second ever Grand Slam and his first Wimbledon men's singles title. The 20-year-old upset world #1 Novak Djokovic, who was aiming to clinch his 5th straight title. Sunday's final was a 5-set epic, with Alcaraz looking like he had a mountain to climb after conceding the first set 1-6. But he managed to level and then overtake his Serbian opponent before Djokovic leveled by winning the 4th set. Down to the deciding 5th, Alcaraz beat the defending champion 6 games to 4. The Czech Republic's Markita Vondrousova won the women's title on Saturday in 2 straight sets, becoming the first unseeded woman to win the Wimbledon crown.
Good morning. We need to stay weather aware. More torrential downpours are forecast to lash parts of Chungcheongdo, Gyeongsangdo, and Jeollado provinces, dumping 30 to 60 millimeters and hours of rain through this morning. Heavy rain warnings remain in place in most of the southern provinces, and the rain front will get more powerful tomorrow, dropping heavier rain on Korea. And until tomorrow, southern regions need to brace for 250 millimeters of massive rainfall. We're talking about 60 to 100 millimeters an hour of extreme downpours in southern parts of the country. Well, that's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
We thank you for watching New Day at Arirang. Stay safe wherever you are.